Going into Avengers Endgame, the odds were stacked against both Captain America and Iron Man surviving the film. Whenever we talk about who wasn't going to make it to Marvel's Phase 4, these two were always at the top of our lists. But instead of focusing on how their superhero careers ended, let's talk about the journey that got them there, and the true purpose of their roles in Endgame. Sure, Tony is frivolous, self-absorbed, and arrogant, but he's also greatly motivated by fear. He was terrified when he escaped from that cave in Iron Man, and he built up an army of suits so he could protect himself and those he cared about. During the original Battle of New York, he was so horrified by how powerless he felt and how unprepared he was that he ended up creating Ultron. Of course, this made him all the more unsafe, but let's not pile onto the guy right now. We've seen the effect fear had on Tony during Iron Man 3, and it can even explain why he was so eager to support the Sokovia Accords in Civil War. He knows heroes can be dangerous, and how he specifically can be dangerous despite his best efforts. On the flip side, we have sweet, virtuous Steve Rogers, who almost always puts the needs of others above his own, not because he fears the consequences, but because he believes it's the right thing to do. So it was no surprise Tony and Steve didn't exactly see eye to eye when they first met. Steve accused Tony of being selfish and unwilling to sacrifice for others, and Tony believed Steve was too much of an idealist propped up by the super soldier serum. A few movies later, in Captain America Civil War, the two ended up on opposite sides of a conflict, and we saw some major changes. Steve Rogers was becoming jaded and disillusioned, and rebelling against the authority he had always supported. Meanwhile, Tony Stark was overcome with concern for others and desperate for the help of his friends. However, some fans had an issue with this, claiming we hadn't seen enough evidence of a friendship between Tony and Steve. Sure, these two might not have grown up together like Steve and Bucky, and they clearly didn't text daily, mostly because Captain America still uses a flip phone, but they've been through some heavy stuff together. If that doesn't build a strong friendship, we're not sure what does. Interestingly enough, Tony Stark is also surprisingly like another major Marvel character, and this one isn't a superhero. Even before we saw Tony don his own Infinity Gauntlet, it was clear he had a connection with the Mad Titan Thanos. Remember when we talked about Tony being motivated by fear? In Age of Ultron, he revealed how terrified he was by the idea of unstoppable creatures from another planet. And Thanos is pretty much the embodiment of Tony's worst nightmare, so many of his actions are driven by this future threat, just as Thanos is motivated by the threat of limited resources. They're both concerned with what's going to happen, and it drives them to occasionally do reckless things which have unintended consequences. Would Tony become a villain like Thanos? Maybe not intentionally, but practically. Or would he be able to choose a different path? In the lead up to Avengers Endgame, it was pretty much a given that someone was going to have to be sacrificed. Most of us had our money on Captain America, especially considering he already tried to sacrifice himself once in Captain America: The First Avenger. But Tony Stark was another good guess, and that one turned out to be the case. Steve once accused Tony of being too selfish to sacrifice himself for others, but Tony proved once and for all that's not the case. Tony stood up to his greatest fear and laid down his life to protect others, and not because he was afraid of Thanos. As he pointed out earlier in the movie, he had a wonderful life post-decimation, and he risked it all to save the day. As for Steve Rogers, he volunteered for the hazardous mission of returning the Infinity Stones to their rightful places in time. But he decided to take his time on the way back and live out his life in his rightful time. While we would never begrudge him for this, when it comes down to it, this was an ultimately selfish act. It wasn't for the greater good. It didn't save any lives. And if anything, it means the MCU has one less active hero going forward. Steve Rogers looked out for his own needs and self-interests, and that's not a bad thing. In a way, the endings of Tony Stark and Steve Rogers represent the extent of their friendship and what they've learned from one another. Not only did we get to see that these two heroes have learned from each other, but we also got to see the reunion we had been waiting for since Civil War ended. Sure, it was less than joyful at first, but it was good to see them patch things up and move forward, relying on the trust they'd built up over the years. There was no shortage of witty banter during Endgame, and when we weren't holding our breath or cheering, we were usually laughing. But these two heroes took a break from the constant witticisms to share a genuine moment with one another, and reaffirm their friendship. Steve will likely be taking on the role Tony once had of superhero logistics, and worry about Peter Parker. What do you think about the relationship between Tony Stark and Steve Rogers? Were you able to predict their fates, or were you surprised by what happened in Endgame? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below, and then click on that subscribe button for more from us here at CBR. Bye for now.